So, what was your favorite part of the interview, Kristine?
Oh, I don't know. I, I have such compassion for people where this creationism deal is an unnecessary hindrance or hurtfulness.
Hmm.
I mean, it just shouldn't be that the details of how old the earth is shouldn't cause that much hurt. It just shouldn't.
I think in our ministry, we kind of see people who have that hurt in that area, but also others. I mean, if you grew up fundamentalist or in the evangelical church, even voting, like if you vote Democrat, you could be an outcast, or if
Um,
you're not pro-life, or if you don't support the Second Amendment with any rigor. These are things that I do, but I wouldn't hold against my kids if they didn't. But or if you were questioning your sexuality, but something so non-essential like the age of the Earth, for that to have that
right.
kind of an effect on parents, or even fellows at church, and you've tasted this in your own family. Your own kids have kind of
Well,
tasted this kind of thing, and I think when people who are certain like that are challenged and they really don't have a robust defense, they become fearful and they respond with first shame. Like, do you know what this is going to do to your mother? And if that doesn't work, or wait till the pastor finds out, people, what you just posted on Facebook. First they try shame, and when shame doesn't work, unfortunately, they shun. So
mhm.
they've got two strings on their guitar, and when shaming doesn't work, they shun, and that's a real tribal reaction
Yeah.
to difference,
There's a third
and
string.
it's sad. Yeah.
The third string is they dismiss. They decide, okay, well, you're really, something progressive that's not a Christian. You probably don't even really believe Jesus physically died and rose again. You probably really aren't a Christian. So they dismiss you by justifying that you're not really a Christian, so they can continue claiming or believing that the real Christian way is my way.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I think those parts of the interview with David, I mean, it's fascinating to hear about the movie that he was a part of and so forth, and his own journey. But I think the fascinating things to me were the emotional parts that he went through, when he
Mhm.
said that because he had a difference of opinion with Nathaniel Jameson, he was, now he's on the bad list, Santa's bad list. So, folks, I think you're going to love this interview. It's kind of heartfelt. It's emotional at times. David is just a fascinating young man. We could have talked to him for hours, but I think you're going to enjoy what's coming up.
Today we have David Mcmillan. He's a law student, author, and science advocate who grew up in the Young Earth Creationist movement before going to college for a degree in physics. His role in the award-winning independent documentary We Believe in Dinosaurs highlights the struggles of leaving indoctrination and fundamentalism. Welcome, David. Thank you for joining us today. All right. Well, let's talk about the movie We Believe in Dinosaurs. You were a player in that movie. Tell us about the movie and your role.
Yeah, it was a really great experience. I was really happy to get to be a part of the project. 137 Films has done a variety of films on science and culture and the influence on politics and how religion and science and culture all kind of mingle. And so this project was their biggest project to date. They started out just wanting to learn about the Ark encounter, wanting to learn about creationism and the overall impact that creationism has had on a lot of communities. And in that in that process, they started talking to me, and we ended up having a lot of interviews. So the movie talks a lot about this ark that was constructed by Answers to Genesis. It's like a museum / amusement park / evangelistic effort. And it talks about how that was built and the impact that it's had on that community, how there were some issues with tax money, separation of church and state, and then it talks about the perspectives of some of the people who were involved, myself included. And so it was a really great experience. I was just so glad I got to do it.
How about, what was the time frame? How long did that take for filming and then to be produced and released?
Yeah, we started filming, I want to say, back in late 2014, early 2015. So we're talking about a period of 4 to 5 years of filming. It started out very informal. That was just going to be like one interview or maybe 2 interviews, and then they just kept coming back, and the project evolved over time. And so after I had written an article that was an open letter to Bill Nye when he was getting ready to debate Ken Ham, the president and CEO of Answers to Genesis, and they saw that letter, they wanted to talk to me, and that's kind of how it got started.
Okay. And you used to be a Young Earth Creationist yourself, right? You were writing for Answers in Genesis. Tell us about your journey, about how you went from being such a strong promoter.
Tell us about your betrayal. Why did you betray the Lord Jesus and God and the Bible and Christians, David?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I had to say it. It just felt right.
I'm the big bad. I grew up in the evangelical community, in the kind of primarily independent fundamentalist evangelical community. We had a lot of connections to. I was homeschooled. We had a lot of connections to the broader homeschooling community, sort of the prepper kind of anti-establishment religious communities that spread around the United States in the 1990s, and Answers in Genesis was always a big part of my upbringing. At a very young age, my dad would take me to the Answers in Genesis conferences, the Creation Ministries International conferences, going to see Ken Ham, going to see a lot of the different speakers who had backgrounds in science, who would talk about the Bible, talk about evolution, talk about the age of the earth. So that was always very important to me. It became more important to me than it was to my family. I was kind of the resident expert on the age of the earth and on evolution and everything like that, both in my family and in groups that involved my, other homeschoolers in the area, stuff like that. And one of the reasons that I went to college to get a degree in physics was so hopefully I could come back and work for Answers to Genesis, or be someone who was an authority on evolution and creation. I had written some articles for their website. I was closely connected to a lot of the Answers to Genesis Answers Department people who would write about this stuff. And so I had the chance to write some articles. It was pretty cool. I felt really good about myself. And so going into an undergrad to get a degree in hard science from a secular university, that was my thing. I avoided biology classes and geo classes because I wanted to stick with one thing, and physics is pretty agnostic when it comes to the age of the earth. But obviously you've got stuff with astronomy, you've got stuff with some radiometric dating that gets into some physics, but for the most part, you can get a degree in physics and not have to worry as much about the age of the earth. And so that was my goal. And that's how it got started. It was through college I learned how to research more, and so that's when things started breaking apart a little bit.
So how did that look for you? I mean, you're really tied in to Young Earth Creation. How did you overcome and really change paradigms?
Growing up in that worldview, there were always questions I couldn't answer, because I would get into arguments, debates with anyone who would debate me. I think my very first presence anywhere on the internet, I left a message on the Talk Origins message boards, arguing about the second law of thermodynamics. I was very engaged in coming to a in debating all these things, and I would always have things I would come up against that I couldn't deal with very well, and I just chalk that up to inexperience. And, the scientists at Answers in Genesis, they have a much better view of all this than I do. So I just need to grow up and learn more, and then I'll be able to answer these questions. And sometimes I would talk to the folks at Answers in Genesis and say, hey, can you explain this or can you explain that? And they would give some explanation, and it wouldn't be enough. And I would ask for some more, and I would just assume someday I'm going to be able to figure this out. I'm going to go get my degree. I'll be able to research. I'll be able to answer these questions. And so that was what I tried to do. And then in doing that, it really, I sort of kept on coming up against things that weren't really working out for me in terms of explanations. And so that started to break down a little bit. I came to a point where I was like, well, creationism is true. The earth is only 6,000 years old, but maybe it's not all as obvious as I thought. I can still believe this, but I can still recognize that evolution makes good predictions, and it's not bad science. I just don't agree with it. And at the same time, being in a secular university in a new environment, I was exposed to a lot of new experiences and people that I thought were bad, that I thought were evil, that I really couldn't hold on to that kind of a view anymore. And so those things sort of broke down over time.
So David, you're kind of describing exactly what George Barna and Ken Ham wrote in their book Already Gone. You're talking about a good kid raised with a good upbringing with the truth of the Word of God, and he goes to the secular university, and within one semester they brainwash him. So help us discern who's right on that, because you have people, I'll just say, you have people on the biologos end of Christianity, if people even consider that a wing. Some people don't. But if you have the biologos choir over here and they're saying, look, you exposed kids to pseudoscience and to these kind of unnecessary obstacles, they're going to end up losing their faith. And then you have Ken Ham saying, if you don't expose them to these things more, if they're not firmly rooted in a discussion on the literal history of Genesis and other things and the authority of the Bible, that they're going to lose their faith when they go to university. So which are you?
That's where, if Answers in Genesis ever had a shot at taking someone and making them science proof or culture proof or secular university proof, it was me. I was like 16 years old, and I was calling around to different universities that claimed to be Christian and like quizzing the biology professors. Well, do you believe the Bible? That was me. They had their shot. I was as radically creationist as you can be. And I was as inculcated in the creationist worldview as anyone could be. And it took a long time. By the time I graduated, I was still kind of on the fence. So we're talking 4 or 5 years in a secular environment, before it was able to ever, gain any traction. And so, the hard thing for me was getting to the point where I didn't think that evolution was completely nonsense. I still was a Christian. I still believed in Young Earth and everything like that, but it just wasn't as open and shut as I'd always been led to believe. And so I came up against this position. Well, do I hold to what I think is an essential part of Christianity, this creationist worldview, and reject science, or not? And again, if there was ever anyone to be convinced of the science, it would have been me. I was pretty much sent there to get my credentials in the secular world. And so, they had their shot.
So you basically land where Todd Wood is today. Somebody who recognizes that evolutionary biology works and makes predictions, and yet he clings to his faith because of his reading, or he clings to Young Earth because of his reading of Genesis. He thinks it's if the Bible, his understanding of the Bible trumps what God's other book of nature says, he's going to go with the Bible tells me so, as the critics of the Bible say. How come you didn't stay there?
I mean, I actually read, I think, the infamous blog post by Todd Wood that said, look, stop claiming that evolution is a theory in crisis. Stop claiming that we can, that it's all nonsense. It's making good predictions. We're just making, a different choice. And that freed me up a little bit to say, okay, well, I can hold these views in tension. I can say that. That's okay. And it was really learning that, like, my view of church history, my view of people in the history of the church who had different views that I really hadn't been exposed to as much as I thought I had. Answers to Genesis loves to talk about different theologians or different scientists through history who they say were creationists. Isaac Newton is one they hold up a lot. And I remember reading a letter where Isaac Newton wrote, he was writing to a friend of his about Moses and about the first book of the Torah, about the first few chapters of Genesis. And Isaac Newton is very clear. He's like, yeah, we're going to say this is describing things in a sort of common language, a common way of expressing them. It doesn't mean 6 literal days. It doesn't mean that the earth formed before the sun. That's preposterous. Everyone knows this. And so just actually reading the church fathers and reading the writings of these people who had been held up to me as creationists that weren't, that was like, okay, well, maybe I don't have to hold this as that in that strong way, the way that like Todd Wood does, where it's not, he doesn't have the option of holding Christianity and evolution together. So just sort of being shown that those tropes about creationist authors and stuff weren't true, that helped.
So I need one more swing of the axe and then back to Kristine for a series of questions. So when you get to that point, when you leave the Todd Wood area, I assume you do that because of what you just said. I take you at your word. I think living there had to be a cognitive dissonance, right? There's some kind of uncomfortable feeling that you're in a place that doesn't quite make sense, right? That there's something wrong with that. And so now you move on to a more comfortable place. I have to ask you the question that I'm sure the atheists watching or the people who've deconstructed their faith because they've, tumbled down the same flight of stairs as you. How are you holding on to your faith at this point? If the, vast majority of your life in the faith was tethered so closely to this idea that, well, this is either true or it's not true and godless evolution is true. Yeah. How did you not live within that binary of either this and this? How did you find a third path?
I think that at the point that it all hit me that, none of the creationist views were true, and I think probably to my, it helped me out. I had already kind of come to terms with the biology first, and it was just the age of the earth issue. So that helped a little bit. But because Todd Wood with biology and stuff like it was like, okay, yeah, I can see how evolution could be true if there was enough time, but there's not enough time, therefore we don't have to worry about it. By the time that it all broke down, and I saw a piece of evidence that was really obvious that said, no, the universe is very old. At that point, I had seen so many times that the Kinham model, the Kinham worldview had been broken, that voice that was put into us from a very young age, that if you give up creationism, you give up everything, that was not very loud anymore. I didn't take that as a very viable position. And so knowing that Kinham was wrong about the age of the earth and about biology and about chemistry and about physics, it made me think, well, maybe Kinham's wrong about religion too. Maybe he's wrong about Christianity. Maybe he's wrong about Christianity needing creationism to function. And I don't know how that's going to look. I don't know what Christianity is going to look like without creationism. And in some ways I still don't. But I'm not going to take his word for it. I'm not going to just accept that he's right about that and throw everything else out when I have a chance to figure out where I want to be. And that helped. Knowing that he was wrong about science made me accept, okay, maybe he's wrong about religion too.
So what was that final straw, that last piece of evidence that was so compelling that you were able to step away?
So one of the questions that I had always struggled with was this idea of starlight and time, where you have distant galaxies, even stars in our own Milky Way that you can see from Earth, that are more than 6,000 light years away. One of the first things I think was told to me was, well, maybe God, created the stars mature, so their light was already here, and that doesn't work out for a lot of reasons. We see supernovas, we see things moving, and they're far more than 6,000 light years away, so we know it's not just some magic light show. We're actually seeing real things. And then there was, well, maybe light changes how fast it goes, and that doesn't work. And then Russell Humphreys had some idea about the expansion of the universe, and once I was able to use a supercomputer, I actually I actually did the math, and okay, that doesn't work either. And then because there are a lot of different views, and I thought maybe there's a way that light can get here in 6,000 years, and I'm just not going to worry about it. And then I saw a picture. This is in the movie, and I really like the way they did it in the movie. They had it. It was really cool. But I saw a picture that Hubble had taken of a galaxy that's falling into the center of a cluster of galaxies, and as it's falling in, it's moving, thousands of times faster than the speed of sound, and so the impact of this galaxy against all of this dense gas is stripping away stars and stripping away all of this dust, and it's forming this trail through the stars. And there's another telescope image of the same galaxy that showed a trail through space 200,000 light years long. And it doesn't matter what you believe about how light could have different speeds or whatever, you can't have something that moves 200,000 light years in 6,000 years. Not like a galaxy can't do that. And so that was where I was like, okay, this can't work. This doesn't work. This doesn't make sense. This is obviously, something that's been moving through space for millions of years, and I can't make that work any other way. So I really just have to give this up.
Okay, so you gave up Young Earth Creation, but you haven't given up Christianity, and instead now you write kind of on the dark side, the other side, about the problems with Young Earth Creationism, and you recently wrote an article with Dr. Joel Duff called "Descent with Modification," which is kind of a clever title. Tell us about this article.
Right. So one of the things that like I said, the movie We Believe in Dinosaurs, it talks about this Ark encounter. It talks about the how the Ark was built and everything. And then at the end of the film, I walk through the Ark and I'm seeing all of these different displays. One of the things in the film, I was a lifetime charter member, still am, of the Creation Museum when it was built when I was a teenager. And so the way that they depict like all these animals getting onto the Ark in the Creation Museum kind of goes one way. But they've evolved a lot in their views over the decade or whatever between the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter. And when you get to the Ark Encounter, there's a very different presentation. You have all of these animals that don't look like the animals that we see around us today at all. There's this thing that it looks sort of like a giraffe, but it's small and it has a short neck. And that's supposed to be the ancestor of a bunch of different species, including giraffes and other ruminants. They have the way that they present the animals on the Ark is very weird and it's confusing. I was walking through the Ark Encounter, and everyone around me, all of these homeschoolers and Christians and everyone who were going through it didn't make sense to them. And that's because in order to shrink the number of animals on the Ark, they've come up with this hyper-evolution idea where only a few species were on the Ark, and then they evolved right after the end of the flood into all of these other species. And that's something that creationists have said for a long time, but they've really gone to a new level now in taking this kind of an approach. And when I talked to some people at Answers in Genesis, a couple of years back, they were saying, "Oh yeah, we don't know. Maybe all ruminants, cattle and sheep and giraffes and deer, maybe they all have a common ancestor. Maybe all dogs and bears and seals have a common ancestor. And it's those kinds of ideas where that's not something that sounds like the creationism of 20 or 30 or 50 years ago. And so that's what the article is about, kind of breaking down how their attempts to group animals together in a way that will fit them onto the ark is kind of leading them down the path of common descent. Obviously, they're going to put a stop on it at some point because it starts to get embarrassing, but that's what the article is about, and it kind of explores that, and it's really kind of an attempt to explain to maybe people in the education community who haven't been exposed to a lot of creationism, kind of, this is where things are going, this is what you can talk about with your class. If creationism comes up, let's address it, and let's be as aware of what's going on as the creationist students are likely to be.
And one of the terms you use in your article is post-creationism. Define that and tell us about your thoughts on that.
Right. So neo-creationism was a term that was coined by Eugenie Scott, 20-something years ago now, talking about trying to formalize creationism, get into schools, everything like that. Post-creationism is really this sort of emergent thread that expands the idea of created kinds or families of life that creationists have championed for a long time, where they keep grouping new things together. Like the idea, Kurt Wise, he's a prominent creationist. He said, well, maybe seals and bears have a common ancestor. Of course, seals and walruses and everything, those are aquatic animals, and bears are very much terrestrial. But he's acknowledging, okay, these have common morphology. They're genetically very close. They're, as close as certain cats are to one another. And so maybe they have a common ancestor. Maybe that's some evolution that happened after the flood. And so those kinds of viewpoints, or saying that sheep and cows could have a common ancestor on the ark, those are the views that it's moving beyond the creationism that is presented to most lay people, and they're really trying to formalize what they're doing, but they're kind of just discovering common ancestry, and they're discovering evolution. And so that's what, when we talk about post-creationism in the article, that's what we're talking about, this discovery of evolution, just sort of uncomfortably trying to explain things and realizing that there are no barriers on common ancestor relationships. And so that's what it's about.
This is a really big change. I mean, like, when I think of people that I've had a conversation with on creation and evolution, there's a pretty strong pushback that, only microevolution can happen and not macroevolution. But this hyperevolution that they're promoting now it really is macroevolution. And I don't think a lot of the lay people realize that this is happening. What do you think?
Yeah, we talk a little bit about the idea of macroevolution and microevolution. Historically, they would talk about microevolution whenever they just let me back up. In the scientific community, macro and microevolution aren't terms that are always agreed upon very clearly, and a lot of people just try not to use them. But to the extent that they are used, microevolution is the genetic drift and mutagenesis inside of a population that doesn't change, that doesn't lead to speciation within that population. And macroevolution is anything that takes place over more time that ends up splitting populations, that ends up creating new species. And so that's what it means within the scientific community. Creationists have co-opted those terms, and so creationists will say, well, microevolution is anything that we can observe, and macroevolution is whatever we think didn't happen. And so by using those terms, anything that they don't like, they just say is macroevolution, and anything that we can prove happens is microevolution. And but the idea that you could have this bear-like thing on the ark that grows into this population, and you end up with some descendants that are walruses, and some descendants that are seals, and some descendants that are polar bears, and some descendants that are panda bears. That's macroevolution by any stretch. And so those are the kinds of really broad changes in the creationist paradigm that we wanted to call attention to, because it doesn't fit with what creationists have historically claimed.
Right. So does this also apply from the time of creation in Genesis 1? Were these created kinds that were created in Genesis 1 now hyper evolving into a bunch of different species after creation but before the flood, and then some of those are put on the ark and then afterwards they hyper evolve again? What does the creationist literature have about like the initial
They haven't. Yeah, they haven't really come up with a good answer there. I asked, and I believe it was maybe 2015 or 2016. I asked Nathaniel Jameson. I met with him and I asked him about that question. He now really doesn't like me because of the movie and everything. But he was like, "Well, we don't know. Maybe it came up that there was, maybe God created of different, species, but they were all part of the same kind, or maybe it was just like one homogenous population and then it split up a little bit, or maybe they like hybridized before the flood." They don't have a good answer. They have some graphics at the Creation Museum now that show like pre-flood, like splitting up into different kinds, or one kind splitting up into different species, and then like one species making it through. But like, I don't think they've thought a lot about it, and they've tried to put so much into this post-flood version that they've kind of neglected the rest of it. And so it's a really interesting question because it's not really clear what they think or how they're going to make this work.
I want to jump in for a second, and I hope I'm not distracting you if you have more questions about the article, Kristine. But you brought up something here that kind of plays to the emotions of what you've gone through. You kind of said Nathaniel Jameson doesn't like me now, which we see happening a lot. My wife and I were talking about this morning about people we know who have gone through a similar journey as you, David, and now it's almost like, if you remember Fiddler on the Roof, the three daughters, one married the communist, one married the atheist, one married the Christian, and the only one that was dead to the father was the one who married the Christian. That's what happens sometimes when somebody accepts evolution or expresses doubt about this kind of young earth creationist worldview or evangelicalism. When Hank Hanegraaff left evangelicalism for Eastern Orthodoxy, he was considered a heretic. So let me ask you a little bit about the emotional side of it. And the pain that comes on that side of it, because you're not just accepting the truth. Now you're kind of leaving your family and your church and everything that was dear to you behind you in Plato's cave. And even though the sunsets are better outside the cave, when you go back and you try to coax them out to share that sunset with you, normally you get a pointed response. If you feel comfortable talking about your experience, about the emotions of what you went through and how those pulled you in different ways. I know I've heard Paul Enns talk about his path out of Young Earth Creation, and he said he was willing to stay in it, just quietly closet his newfound truths, because he didn't want to leave the comfort of his family and his community, but he was outed. He was outed by somebody in his community, and his family kind of ostracized him. You don't have to get specific about that, but could you talk a little bit about those kind of emotions that Nathaniel Jameson, this kind of idea that there's not room at the table for the biologos folks. We'll talk to old earth creationists like Hugh Ross, but if you've gone that far off the deep end, if you're accepting atheist evolution, you probably weren't ever saved.
Right. For me, you talk about being outed. Like, I kind of outed myself because I was so excited that everything made much more sense. It was a lot easier. I didn't have to hold so many things in such uncomfortable tension. And I was writing emails to like my family members and like, oh, but think about this and think about that, and it's so much better here. Come join me. Come see the sunset. And there was a big backlash there. They were very upset that I was going against God. I was leading other Christians astray. Who knows what's going to happen to me? If anyone listens to me, God help them. And so that was uncomfortable. When I wrote the article, this open letter to Bill Nye that I mentioned before, Answers in Genesis was very upset. They actually tracked my family down because I was a lifetime member, so they still had my old address. So they tracked my parents down, and they're like, "You can't believe what this guy's saying. Your kid is off the deep end. You've got to restrain him." And, I'm in my 20s at this point. They're not going to restrain me. But that was they were very aggressive. And then I think at some point they were like, "Well, just come talk to us. Come and we can chat about these things. You could answer whatever. We'll answer whatever questions you have." And like I said, I did eventually talk to Nathaniel Jameson, who's this Harvard-educated biologist, biologist geneticist somewhere in there, he didn't convince me of anything, but they were back and forth between this, "You're the devil," and, "Well, let's fix you." Over time, I think they realized this was not going to work, and so Jameson has made several videos about me. He's written a lot of articles about me. Ken Ham has written a lot of articles about the movie. They don't like it. That's fine. As far as like family is concerned, it's been very difficult. My parents would try to get my kids alone and talk to them and be like, "Well, no one thinks that dinosaurs died out like that. God could have made the dinosaurs with people." And my kids are like, "That doesn't make sense." But I've had to deal with that. My parents at this point don't speak to me anymore, and that's really painful. It's really challenging, and so it's hard. But I kind of picked this initially. I outed myself, so I really can't go back. But I wouldn't want to anyway. So
I'm sorry, and that's really hard. Sorry. One of the criticism that I've heard is this idea that, obviously you didn't really read the research or you didn't really investigate it. Because if you would have really investigated it, you would agree with Nathaniel Jameson and Ken Ham. So either you're being dishonest or you didn't really research. How would you respond to that criticism?
That's something that I've gotten a couple of times. And it's usually phrased like, "You said you read this stuff, but you don't agree with us, so therefore you didn't read it, so therefore you must be dishonest." And honestly, it's just really poor. It's not even. I mean, I would say it's poor science. It's not even science. It's just like a parody of science. They're not. It's not good science, and I'm at the point now that I can just say that. I can say, "No, this is nonsense." You can sit there and have these journals that are peer reviewed that talk about how they believe things happened, and I'm sorry, it's not very convincing. I know what real science looks like, and this isn't it. And I can say that because I've been. I can say that even before I was published, but I was exposed to enough science that I just know the difference. And so I know when something is nonsense, and it is. And then you get into arguments from authority and from consensus, and you get into, you can get into the weeds there pretty easily, but it's just, I can say this isn't good science, and so that's my position. If people need to accuse you of lying, or accuse you of dishonesty in order to make their point, then that says more about them than it does about you.
David, you said the science is good, but part of your second step, right, was finding out that the theology wasn't necessarily good. In other words, you were reading Isaac Newton and Augustine and others who didn't take that literally or see it as young earth creation. And then I don't know when it was that maybe you became familiar with this whole environment of Christians outside of the American evangelical community that basically accept evolution and don't have a problem with that in their faith, and maybe even led you to Biologos or other people like Francis Collins. But How does it make you feel? And would there have been a better approach? What would you recommend for others who are going through this to present it to their family who are steeped in that tradition? To allow them to see that there really is other options theologically, not just scientifically, but theologically, and that there are other, relevant Christians like C.S. Lewis and even Billy Graham, who had no problem with the idea of evolution, if that was God's method.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's really challenging. I think one of the first emails, I sent some stuff to my family about the science, but one of the first emails I sent to my parents and to some of my siblings about this, I got quotes from Newton and Lewis and Augustine and John Wesley and just this whole array of Spurgeon, just everybody that I could think of, because really everyone up until the 1950s, 1960s was okay with the universe being old. Like the only ones who disagreed were Martin Luther and some cult prophet people, and so I threw everything at them, and the response was instant. It was, oh, they're all deceived, and it's just so that was hard. It's really challenging when you grow up with this idea that this is the only possible solution, and so I don't have a all I can say is that for me, just reading and reading and learning more and more over time, it broke down that resistance and that instant, oh man, people are deceived. And so the only thing that worked for me was to get this over and over and over again, that Ken Ham was wrong, that these other writers were wrong, that they weren't really being honest about church history, they weren't really being honest about science, and it just wore me down over time, and it broke down that resistance, because the initial response is always to fight. It's always, they're deceived, they must be confused, they must be off kilter somewhere. We have the only way, and that's just the resistance that's hard down. So for me, it was just the over and over and over again that it worked on me. I know, a couple of my siblings have expressed privately to me that, oh yeah, I know, we don't really think that creationism is true either. We don't make a big deal out of it like you, but it wore us down over time too. And so that gives me some degree of indication, but it's hard because the Answers to Genesis and groups like that, they train you to be resistant. They train you to see an alternate view and to reject it without even thinking. And so it's a really hard worldview to break down.
Yeah, I just want to add this, Kristine, personally. This happened to a family close to us, my wife and I, and the way the other side approaches this, because we say, how could these Christians we've known all this time, who have sat under good teaching and heard about the unconditional love of God and the grace that God shows the sinner, how can they treat others this way, without grace and without this unconditional love? And the idea that came back through channels was they take the verse that to follow Jesus, you must hate mother and father, or hate your daughter-in-law. And they weaponize that verse to allow them to shame and shun people who think differently than them, even if it's a son or a daughter or in-law kind of thing. So I had never even realized that verse can be weaponized in a way to justify that kind of callousness. But it allowed me to see how they could Bible themselves out of having really to fulfill what Jesus asked us to do, Yeah. I'm sorry, Kristine, I stepped on you. Go ahead. Yeah.
This year with COVID, I know that homeschooling has hugely grown. In my area, we have this kind of a hybrid schedule for some kids, and then if the numbers are too high, then it goes back to full distance learning, and it's a nightmare for families and parents who are trying to keep a schedule, and for working parents. So many have opted to homeschool this year, and I think it has about doubled. And I just, my heart is going out to families who are choosing curriculum without the understanding that down the road they could be setting up their kids for the situation that you went through. They probably have really good intentions about picking Christian curriculum so they can teach their kids about God. And why wouldn't you? I mean, of course you would. But without a background in science, they maybe don't realize that the curriculum they're choosing for their little kids will lead down a path of really poor quality science and theology, setting their kids up for crisis of faith in the future. What would you say to homeschooling families that are just starting out, just picking curriculum? How do we keep this next generation from heartache and heartbreak over something so unnecessary as little details of creation?
Yeah. It a lot of trouble with discerning. Christians love to talk about discernment, at least in the evangelical community, and there's a lot of difficulty in discerning what's good education, what's good instruction. I know one of my best friends from college. He was going to this church at one point, and the pastor invited Ken Ham to come and speak, and he thought that Ken Ham was full of it. He thought that, and at this time he was still kind of a creationist and stuff, but he thought that Ken Ham was full of it. A lot of the other people in the church thought that Ken Ham was full of it, but to the elders it was like, oh, he's there to defend the authority of the Bible, and it's really hard. People come with this banner that says we're here to defend the Bible. And what the backside of that banner says is it's our way or else. You have to agree with everything we say, or you're not, or you're barely even a Christian. And so a lot of curriculum, a lot of teachings from these types of groups, they come with this idea that we're going to defend Scripture, and we're going to give you a biblical worldview, and it's a fundamentalist, controlling authoritarian worldview. Where they want control, and it's hard to see that if you can't tell the difference between the two. Like, it's hard to see that. So when it comes to curriculum, when it comes to, there's so much stuff out there. There's a scene in the film where you're in this Amazon-like warehouse with millions of books and DVDs and everything else that's all this homeschooling creationist instruction, and they've just quietly built up this huge amount of power over homeschooling groups and churches across the country. And so it's really challenging to find curriculum that maybe comes from a Christian perspective, or is at least open to Christianity, that gives kids the kind of instruction that parents want if they're from a Christian community, that doesn't have this backside that says this is the only way that you can view any part of science, and you have to accept this or else. It's very challenging.
Mm-hmm. And now we have Christians who have been told for years and years, for decades, that you can't trust the scientists, that you can't trust even government or big farm, or these authorities that aren't the Bible authority. And we're seeing that played out in the response to COVID. What have you seen in this pandemic time for Christians who are skeptical of the science?
Yeah. It was heartbreaking to see. I know John MacArthur, he was insisting on keeping his church open and going over all of this stuff. John MacArthur is a very prominent evangelical and pastor, and we should obey God rather than man, and keeping his church open despite soaring COVID cases in his community. To be on the outside of that worldview, it looks bad. It paints Christians as extremists. It looks awful to anyone on the outside to think these Christians are valuing their their traditions and their wallets and their community standards and everything over the lives of everyone around, and that just looks bad. That just it's just not it's awful. And of course, seeing all the people that I grew up with, all of the pastors that I used to that I used to go to their churches, talking about, oh, COVID cases here aren't anything, and almost no one's really died in this area, and they're just, it's so easy for them to buy into this anti-government, anti-establishment, anti-elite approach that denies the science and ignores basic common sense measures, and it's hard to know how to reach them. And the only thing I can say is, like, you realize everyone around you is looking at you and thinking, is this what Christ is like? Christ Christianity means valuing your traditions over the safety and welfare of everyone around you, because that's what it is. You're not persecuted because people tell you to put on a mask. You're not persecuted because people say, shut your church down, do virtual services until people stop dying. That's not persecution. That's not, oh, well, they hated Christ, so they'll hate us. No, you're being an asshole. Sorry, but that's the kind of perception that people are going to get, and so it's not Christ-like. That's all I can say is you're not being Christ-like. So think about that.
Yeah, I've heard that there's been some discussion at our church and confusion why we have a segment of our church that's so resistant to masks and distancing protocols, and they're perplexed by that. And I just feel like, wow, I've been grooming Christians to reject science for so long. Why does this surprise you? It's tragic.
Well, that brings me in to an uncomfortable question for the both of you, but I blame it on Kristine because you opened the door. I'll channel my alter ego, the skeptic. So Romans 1 talks about those that suppress the truth, and it's in regard to creation. So as far as origins goes, and I don't care if you take it in American evangelicalism or globally, what group suppresses the truth more than any other? Is it godless atheists, or is it, I'm not going to say young earth creationists, I'm going to say creation scientists. So in that, I'm going to include intelligent design and old earth creation and young earth creation, all those who are basically denying almost all of the major sciences. So if we look at Romans 1 and we look at these boogeymen that are suppressing the truth, is it the atheists or is it the creation scientists, Kristine?
I think everybody has their biases, and nobody is an expert on everything, nor do we know everything. So I think we need to be a little bit careful in just pointing fingers, because we all need to approach this topic with humility. We're still learning. There's still a lot to learn. But yeah, I think there's a lot of creation scientists who, in an effort to defend Christianity, are willing to shuffle the truth or hide data or cherry pick. And that's really sad. If Christianity is true, there shouldn't be any need to defend it with things which aren't true.
One of the things it's very vogue in evangelicalism, obviously, to take portions of the Bible as if they are written to us directly. And one of the things that I've learned is, we take the Bible as written for us, but not necessarily to us. It was written to specific people at a specific time. And so we're going to be we're looking in on that conversation, God, or between this person that God is called to speak, and the people that they're addressing. We're not necessarily the recipients. That being said, Romans 1 is talking about idolatry. It's talking very specifically about the Roman idolatry, and the idea that that the Romans had all of these different gods that they would credit with different things in nature, and that they tried to find their gods through nature. This god for this thing, this god for that thing. And again, like Kristine said, we don't want to point too many fingers. But if we're looking to nature to find the nature of God, then that's probably not a good plan, because that's kind of what Paul is writing about when he writes the book of Romans, that these people are finding their God in their understanding of nature. And so it makes those idols are then the extension of our views about nature. And if your God is nothing more than your view of nature, then that's probably going to lead you down the wrong path. And so if people are saying that you can prove God, or that we know about God because of creationism, we know about God because of our views of science, well, that's not what. It's not like Romans was written about creationists, but looking at where the Romans were going wrong and the Roman Church was going wrong, it's something to think
about. Isaac Asimov said something like, when people thought the earth was flat, they were wrong. And then when people thought the earth was spherical, they were wrong. But if you think that thinking a spherical earth is just as wrong as a flat earth is wrong, then you're even wronger. And we don't know everything, but we continue to learn, and we can eliminate things that really are unlikely to be true. And we can continue to pursue a desire to know the truth, or to hold fast to what is true and move away from what we know is not true or less accurate. And I think that's something we need to train our students and our kids to do in the church, is not just with understanding of the shape of the earth or of nature, but of how we understand Scripture. Kids are always going to come out really concrete and have a very simplistic view of things when they're little, and as they grow up, just like it says in 1 Corinthians 13, you become a man and you put away the childish things. What do you recommend for students as they grow and mature to ease that transition from a simplistic, literalistic view of Scripture and nature to a more complex, nuanced understanding that allows for changes with new data?
Yeah. It's challenging. With my own kids, I've talked about trying to understand the difference between myth and fables and parables and history. Growing up, we were never taught about Santa Claus. Santa Claus was evil because Santa Claus is a lie that parents tell their children, and Easter Bunny, or whatever. Those were always things we weren't supposed to believe in, because we were supposed to trust whatever our parents tell us. And I didn't teach my kids about Santa Claus the same way. We're not trying to pretend that Santa Claus is real, but raising kids with the understanding that ideas things can be true and not history, or things can be history and not really be teaching us anything, those are things that are important for kids to learn. And being able to teach kids how to evaluate things for themselves and how to figure things out for themselves is just super, super important. For parents, I think the important thing is, if your kids have questions and you can't answer the questions, like, tell them I don't know. Tell them I haven't figured that out yet. Let's try to figure it out. Let's find someone who has studied this and see what they have to say, and maybe they'll have it right and maybe they won't, but that's okay. The idea that you have to know and you have to have this concrete understanding of everything or you're adrift is just foolish. And so that's the biggest thing, is being okay with not knowing is the most important thing.
That's a big thing, right? Because I think whether you say fundamentalist or evangelical, I think American Western traditions are so steeped in certainty. And Kristine likes to bring up that this is possibly a result of Enlightenment thinking that we have to square everything and make sure the guys in the lab coats nod and say, yeah, that's right. So I know that's a big difference going for, and it's a state of discomfort too, when you have the pat answers for everything and you've plugged your cognitive umbilical cord into John MacArthur or Ken Ham, and even if you don't have the answers, you look up their book, 200 Answers to Hard Questions or something, and then you recite chapter and verse and you're just comfortable there. Now, there must have been a time that you were comfortable there, David. You were impenetrable, you said, pretty much until you got to university and you were opened up not only to different views, but the fact that you had been probably warned that people with different views have horns growing out of their head. And when you realized they didn't, did that help break down the resistance? Now, I want to ask you a twofold question. One is we asked you how you could have handled your deconversion better. But I think Kristine implied to if you were the parent, if you were the parent of a child who was going through this, whether it's Young Earth Creation or something else, I mean, yeah, and they're coming out of their closet, so to speak, what do you think is the Christian way to handle that kind of relationship going forward? And number two, when you were impenetrable, when you were in Young Earth Creation, did really robust arguments just bounce off you because you presuppose they were, of the devil or just false without even weighing them?
Let me go. I'll invert the script there. When I would argue with people, it wasn't enough for me to just have what I believed and hold on to it. I wanted to be able to convince other people, and I think I didn't just have the material from Answers to Genesis. I also had exposure to some of the Apologia curriculum. Dr. J. Weil, different people who were a little bit outside the Answers to Genesis motif, and that were a little bit more open to asking questions and asking tough questions. Still creationists, but just a little more open. And so I was more comfortable with thinking, okay, I should be able to convince people. I should be able to express things. And so I would hear these arguments, and of course I would have the little the door in my head that would close. I'm not going to let this all the way in, but I still would hold on to it because I need to answer this question. Someone's going to ask me this question later, and I need to be able to give an answer. And so it was this accumulation of questions I couldn't answer, and really genuinely wanting to find those answers. That's what I carried with me. And that's what I thought, I'm going to go and I'm going to get my degree and I'm going to be able to answer these questions. And so that was one of the things that helped. I think if I had been more just with Ken Ham's literature, just in the Answers to Genesis world, maybe those things would have bounced off and I wouldn't have held on to them. I would have thought, well, those people are just nuts and I don't even need to answer them. But I held on to those things. As far as, for a parent or someone else someone who's working their way through anything that's challenging their beliefs, as a parent, and having been a parent, after my deconversion from creationism, I have this desire to know everything and to express everything, to explain everything. I want to have good answers for my kids. And so even though I have come a long way, I still want to be able to say, I don't know. It's okay to wonder. It's okay to not figure it out, and wherever you end up, that's fine. And we can have a dialogue. I wish that my parents had said, it's okay to question these things. You may end up in a different place. You don't have to know everything. We'll still love you no matter what. That's not where they went, but that's what I would want for my kids. If they ever came to me and said that they were struggling, I would say, look, I don't have the answers. I can't give you exactly, something that's going to work perfectly for you. You're going to have to figure out, and wherever that puts you, you're still my kid. I still love you.
Right. So I think that's really, really great. But there are limits to what's still, say, Orthodox Christianity. What's the core? What's the core that that you would really hope your kids would stick with this core, even if they come to different nuances on creationism or end times or some of the peripheral doctrines?
I think I definitely tend toward the more liberal understanding of a lot of things, and I'm going to say, as long as I don't want my kids to end up in a place where they feel that that religion or being religious or holding views, even holding views in tension, is at the root of evil in society. I see the really militant side of atheism that says that all religion is a crutch for the weak and everything, and a lot of times they're just regurgitating the same kind of perspective that Ken Ham has. It's just the opposite. And so, I want my kids to be comfortable with knowing you can disagree with people, you can hold different positions, and that doesn't mean that this group is a blight on society, because whether it's the evangelicals saying that non-Christians and progressives are a blight on society, or it's the militant atheists who are saying anyone religious is a blight on society, both of those things push people away from compromise and from understanding. And so I just don't, I hope my kids don't end up in either group.
What's your answer to that, Kristine? Your answer to your own question.
My answer to my own question. Okay. I think it's an allegiance to Jesus, to following him first, and making choices to obey his teachings on that's throughout Scripture. It's not a formula, it's a relationship, it's a decision. And it's not just attendance in church or following certain rules.
That's great. For me, I think I see a lot of, and Kristine, you didn't say it, but I know you agree with me, so I'm going to out you. But for me, I see a lot of Christian apologetics is wrapped up in fear. And it's from a position where they're trying to help, they're keeping the lion in the cage because they're scared that people might hurt it. And as Chesterton and Lewis said, you don't need to protect the truth like that. The truth can do well enough on its own. So for me, I think I want to instill in my children a love for the truth and a willingness to pursue it, as they say, no matter what. What's the phrase, justice though the heavens may fall? David's a law guy, he could tell us. Because I think God is truth, and I think even the atheist, when he's genuinely pursuing the truth, is actually pursuing a God, even though he doesn't know it at the time. So I think if they have that kind of a healthy relationship toward truth and toward pursuit, I think, David, you said I want to have good answers for my children, and I do too. I almost think it's better if we have good questions for them. And because I think so much of our Western civilization is consumed with having all the answers. But you ended your statement with saying, I'm comfortable saying I don't know. And I would love to see one of these apologists, Kristine, like J. Warner Wallace or Frank Turek, who's posed the question, say, that's a great question, I don't know. Because I don't think they do themselves any service at all to give a third-rate answer to a first-rate question.
Right. I like the idea of the creeds, like the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, just as a guideline for being able to recognize where the core doctrines of Christianity lie, and outside of which are kind of secondary issues, that there should be freedom to have discussions and push back on them within the church. And the church ought to be a safe place for kids and adults to be able to ask those questions and wrestle with the tough issues. Yeah. And I don't really see that, at least not often, not in my church.
I think what you're trying to say too is, or the way I'd say it is, when it comes to Christianity, C.S. Lewis's argument about mere Christianity, I think, is a really powerful one. And, the other day I was in a Mormon's house. I was a guest in a house. And I saw they had a quote by C.S. Lewis, the one, by the sun I see all other things. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, here's a guy, C.S. Lewis had a ministry where Catholics, evangelicals, Mormons find meaning in things he taught and said about Jesus. And to me, that is really powerful. And I think, when it comes to Christianity, you use the term Orthodox, Chesterton term. I would like them to feel comfortable with mere Christianity, because I think this idea, I grew up in a place where people even question, are Catholics Christians? I still see that question thrown around, and it's just, to me, there's a lot of hideous doctrine that has infiltrated the body of Christ, and the hand is saying to the eye, not only I have no need of you, but tell your story walking. I just think that's really unfortunate. Yeah.
Tribalism.
Yeah.
So there's a apologetics conference coming to my area. I attended it last year, but I won't go this year. And though there are several speakers who will be there that will take the opportunity to present a dichotomy that one must choose between science, particularly evolution, and Christianity, that we need to inoculate our youth against the evils of evolution, was one of the comments that came out last year. What do you see as the harm in teaching children that or students, adults, leaders too, part of defending the truth of Christianity is arguing against scientific consensus and evolution and things that are very well established in the scientific community?
I don't want to point too many fingers here again, but it's to me it just exhibits. There's the fear that you're talking about before, fear of not knowing, and fear of losing this grip on faith. But more than just fear, it's the control. I have a very, obviously very strong views about anthropogenesis, specifically about the way that Ken Ham conducts things, the way that group operates. And what I see more than anything else is it's about control, and it's about power, and it's about being able to exercise influence. And so anytime you see someone setting up this our way, this is the way, this is what we have to stick to, and anyone else is a heretic, that kind of an approach, it gives them a lot of power to say who is and isn't in the fold. And so that's a really dangerous thing. That's a really damaging thing. First of all, but thinking that you have to go against science, or that that we are in this other group that we know the truth about science and stuff, it just leads down the rabbit trail of denying. First, it's denying evolution, then it's denying, we're denying biology. We end up denying physics. We start denying climate change, and then I don't want to wear a mask, even if it's going to protect those around me. And it's a really rough place to put people, especially if they think that their faith depends on it.
I'm curious, David, because we've talked about one side of the issue, people coming out of Young Earth Creation and the pitfalls and so forth, and maybe recommendations for parent or kid who's going through that. I'm curious, when somebody doesn't have a safety net and their experience leads them away from the faith, do you have an approach to that person? Like if you had a chance to have a dinner with Paul Enns, who's famously Paulogio, who went through a lot of hurt, probably PTSD from the way he was treated by his family and his church family, and who's now invested in this kind of YouTube, I don't want to call him an atheist, but skeptic. What would your approach be to somebody like that who's thrown the baby out with the bathwater, who has flipped the script and gone from Ken Ham certainty to maybe Richard Dawkins certainty?
Right. I think something that we're all very sensitive to if we grew up in these kinds of in this kind of an environment is the need to evangelize and the need to fix people who have the wrong idea. And so, from like anyone who's come out of the evangelical world, anything where you're coming at them and saying, "Well, here you got this thing wrong, so let me come fix that for you. I can give you the answers." It doesn't get you anywhere. I've talked to a lot of people who are in that area, and it's I want to say, well, let's find the common ground. Where are the harms? We have harms in the rejection of the science. We have harms in the impact on science education. We have harms in the rejection of climate change as a existential risk. Let's find things that we can agree on and work together. And because I think I came out of this worldview with a lot of pragmatism. Like, okay, if this, let's find something that actually works, that actually does what it's supposed to, and not be just bound to a set of principles that might be wrong. If we can find common goals, then that's a starting point, and that's probably the most important starting point we can
have. That works for Daryl Davis, the black jazz pianist who befriends members of the KKK, and they actually find common ground and eventually. So basically, your advice is to just to be a friend, be somebody who listens and doesn't try and get them to buy the timeshare. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think that's really good advice. John, do you want to ask your tough question?
I feel almost guilty. This has been such a great interview. I feel guilty putting him in the corner, but I think he's studying law, so he knows how to get out of stuff like this. My tough question that Kristine is referring to, David, is really one that I think an atheist would ask in light of how schizophrenic the bride of Christ looks at times. And it goes something like this. So it's different every time I ask it. Let me approach it this way. So if the Christian has the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, right? The leading of the Holy Spirit has the advantage of having God's word, has the the community of the church, and has all these advantages. The mind of Christ. Then how is it possible for the church to get heliocentricity wrong and stay wrong for a couple hundred years? How is it possible that even though they got that wrong and they got both books of scripture wrong there, nature and scripture, and now they seem to be making the same mistake with Darwin? Doesn't that evidence a fact that there might not be any furniture behind the curtain in the Holy of Holies?
Yeah. It is a tough question. I just go back. Power corrupts, and anytime you give someone a way to gain power over other people, that's where you get into trouble. You look at the history of creationism, up the mid 20th century, there weren't any real big arguments about the age of the Earth. Deep time, that was accepted easily. Geology was accepted easily. There was some resistance to Darwin, mostly racist resistance, but it became a source of power, and that's where the problem started. And so anytime you give a group of people, usually a group of white men, a bunch of power and the chance to use that power to gain control over other people, you shouldn't trust anything intellectually that comes out of that, because it's just asking for just trouble. So that's my answer there.
So where can we look to trust resources? What do you recommend for someone who's thinking, oh my, I think I'm I'm concerned that maybe my resources are too narrow or are from that group, and I would like better resources. What do you recommend?
Yeah. The biggest thing I think is just recognizing that there isn't a big conspiracy of power and control in the sciences. Most scientists are underfunded and are looking at some really small thing and they're really excited about it and no one else is. So, there is no big conspiracy. There is no orthodoxy of science that's driving out opposing views. So you don't have to be afraid to just actually read the sources and read the research and look at things. Obviously, there's great material that National Center for Science Education puts out. BioLogos, from a religious perspective, puts out a ton of great information. And hey, if you need to make a pit stop with Hugh Ross, fine. If you need to look at a diversity of views, some of which I think are kind of nonsense, that's fine. Just open yourself up to realizing that there are multiple voices, and it's not like one group has everything right, and you can be okay with that. Straddle the fence. You can take a little bit here and a little bit there, because I think once you start to do that, and once you start, it helps you to evaluate sources a little bit more honestly, and then that's not going to lead you anywhere wrong.
That's good. So imagine the youth leaders, youth pastors, the volunteer youth leaders, and the paid youth pastors who have this youth group, and kids have questions about science and faith, and they don't have a strong background in science. What do you advise them to help the students as they're navigating integrating science and faith, especially if they get some, really geeky, science-minded students who have these tough questions and they don't have the background to answer? Where do you suggest they go? What do you suggest they say? I mean, you've answered before, I don't know. But I don't know should be followed up with, let's go investigate together. Let's look here.
Yeah.
Where should they start?
The easy thing. The easy thing is I don't know. Let's call David that, because that works great. But if you're not going to go that route, I don't know. Let's find a couple of sources. Let's have a few different people come up with, where do you get your information? Where do you get your information? And next class or whatever, let's have people find out what they found out. And so maybe you get something that Ken Ham wrote. Maybe you get something that Hugh Ross wrote. Maybe you've got something from the Smithsonian talking about the dinosaurs or whatever. Like, let's get a few different viewpoints and let's talk about them. The trouble in that situation is you have elders, you have people in the church who are usually influential who don't want these kinds of questions asked. And that's always a big challenge, especially in these groups. But
I think one thing I'd like to interject on that question, Kristine, is that a lot of times it's not information. A lot of times it's not intellectual doubt that the person is struggling with. It's emotional or volitional doubt, and they're scared. They kind of suspect that they're in Plato's cave, but they're scared at the ramifications of what it would mean to explore elsewhere. And I think one of the things that you can do is to show that there are other views that are Christian, and not only Christian, but there are solid Christians that hold those views or who have in the past. I think David brought up that is one of the big moments, the watershed moments for him, was to find out that Ham misconstrued what Isaac Newton believed. And that could be a very powerful thing to realize, that you wouldn't be leaving the cave alone, that there's people who have made this journey before you. It's okay. You're not anti-Christian if you look at these other points of view. But for some people, it's really hard to do. Now, if it is emotional and volitional doubt, if you find yourself giving somebody really good information and the response is it goes in one ear and out the other, you're not dealing with intellectual doubt. That's somebody who's scared. you're going to be dealing with fear or sense of betrayal or abandonment or what have you.
Yeah. So, and I would encourage too to say, however God decided to create, he decided that. It was his decision. It wasn't up to me. He may have chosen methods that wouldn't have been my preference, but I need to trust him that he did what he thought was the right way to create. I mean, that's what he did. He did it. It's not up to me. So I have to just kind of let go of what I want the answer to be and know that if I discover it wasn't what I thought it should be, that I'm the one that needs to change, right? I'm the one that needs to adjust and say, okay, God, you're sovereign. You did what you wanted. And, that's got to be okay with me because you're God and I'm not. And in my journey, that was kind of the place I came to before I even investigated things like evolution, because my background is aerospace engineering and not biology. And I wish more youth pastors and leaders would give the kids the freedom so they don't have this guilty conscience when they go off to biology class or when they're wondering, hey, I'm seeing something that isn't the way I think it ought to be. To trust that God can do what he wanted, what he still wants to do.
And Kristine, you opened Pandora's box again and let my alter ego out by saying what you just did. Yes, it's God's, right? God's sovereign. He can do it. I think the skeptic would yell at you right now, then, if God's not the author of confusion, then why are Christians at each other's throats over origins? Why did he make it? Is he that ineffective to make it confusing? Why did he allow Genesis to be ancient Near Eastern myth and garbled for a couple thousand years before somebody kicked over a rock in 1850 and found Ashurbanipal's library? So this opens up some difficult questions, even for somebody like John Walton. Then, even a 7th century BCE Assyrian Sargon was more effective at retaining his words because he wrote in clay. So,
but is that really true? I mean, aren't we getting all of the extra resources at the same time that we're developing the better science and understanding? Aren't they both coming about together, such that the confusion is only a matter of our lack of understanding, but the answers are there? I mean, we've got the additional archaeological information and the ancient Near Eastern writings along the same time that we're developing additional scientific understandings of genetics and mapping the human genome. I think he's providing them in parallel so that we can have the resources we need as the science develops.
I think, I agree with you, but I think our conversation, as you've heard it, kind of misses the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And that gorilla isn't the age of the earth or evolution. The gorilla is inerrancy. And when the whole Young Earth people take the idea that God wrote Genesis, that God wrote it, or he whispered the exact words into the ears of the authors, now you run into the difficulty that my alter ego presented. Is he that inefficient then? And that opens up that door, which has breathed life into atheist arguments and made Bart Ehrman's career, because Christians have tried to oversell, I think, what the Bible is or claims to be. And so I know we rarely talk about inerrancy, but I actually think that's the biggest stumbling block for people leaving Young Earth Creation, is because they have this idea that they're not just abandoning family and First Village Baptist Church or whatever, but that they have to leave God, what God said. Yeah. They're actually leaving what God said for what Darwin said. And, are you going to, Ken Ham has beaten into the heads over and over, fallible man, you're accepting the words of fallible man. instead of God. And so we cede that argument to him in a sense because Christians are scared to touch the third rail of theology, which is inerrancy. And I don't think we can remain bashful about that topic anymore and still be effective about talking about these things, because Ken Ham keeps playing that card, the authority of God's word. This isn't about how old the earth is. It's the authority of God's word. And he creates this false binary that if you don't believe the way he interprets his hermeneutic on Genesis, that you're outside of the family of faith somehow, whether you know it or not. I don't know. Your thoughts on that, David?
When I was growing up, obviously creationism was very important to us. But that wasn't just the only thing. I was very interested in eschatology. I was very interested in the end times. I was, is Israel something, is the nation state of Israel something that's predicted in the Bible, and how should this affect our politics? And, we really had the idea, this chronological snobbery that, as 20th century, 21st century evangelicals, we had, the Bible was uniquely written to us for our perspective. And like I said before, you have to break down that idea that the Bible is written to you, because it isn't. God didn't write it. Assuming everything else about Christian orthodoxy, God didn't write the Bible for you. You're looking at conversations that God had through prophets or through apostles or whatever with other people. And so you have to take a little bit of humility and say, I'm looking at someone else's conversation. I'm reading over someone else's shoulder, and this isn't written to me, and I can't make this about me. Whether that's the creationist mindset that says, oh, the Bible is full of scientific facts we only just now figured out, or eschatology, or some things about history that that Christians have held to for a long time as inerrant that maybe aren't. You gotta have a little humility in that area.
You both brought up the word humility, and I think that what's missing from Christian apologists and even the Western Church is that very idea, the idea expressed by the Apostle Paul, who says we see through a glass dimly. And I don't see many in the church. I don't see many pastors or theologians or apologists having that kind of humility.
Kristine, you mentioned Isaac Asimov earlier. He has a book, one of his short novels, his early ones was called Nightfall. And it was about a planet that never has night because it has like six different stars in the sky that are close to it. And so they never have night. And every 2,000 years, like some moon covers up one of the stars and in the right place, and night falls on the entire, on half the planet, and it drives everyone mad because they don't know what it's like. And so the scientists are like predicting when this is going to happen. They're like, okay, this is what's going to happen. Everyone be ready. We're gonna get through this. It's going to be night. And they explain it to everyone, And so the night falls. There's this eclipse of the nearest star, and they see billions of stars, and they didn't know what stars were. They didn't, and so they go mad. They all go crazy because that was so much bigger and so much more amazing and so much more mind-blowing than they could have anticipated. And that's what it made me think of just now. You're talking about humility and we see but through a glass dimly. We can try and figure out all of these answers, and we can plan for maybe our worldview to be upset. That we don't have a good idea. We don't know what else is out there. We don't know how big of a paradigm shift we might have to face. So.
David, are you in a comfortable place right now in your journey? I mean, I know there's others that are going to be listening to this, and they want to know if it gets better. I mean, where are you right now? I mean, as far as the faith goes and the understanding of the science, I know you've got relationships with people in the faith and out of the faith, and it's one of the things that I really admire about the page Answers to Answers in Genesis, that it kind of is a great way for people, maybe differing faiths, to come together and say, as you said before, here's some common ground. Let's talk about these exciting things.
I mean, it definitely gets better. I'm in a rough place personally, just because of the things I've gone through with family. and with family members that are so upset about my religious views that comes between us, even though I would like it not to. And so that is a challenge. If you think that's going to be too hard for you, speaking to someone who's still in it, who's struggling, maybe don't out yourself right away. They're not going to just accept everything you say, and you're just going to have to be okay with that. And so there's that. But it does get better, and I can certainly come to a place where I don't have all the answers, but I know bad answers when I see them. So I'm not worried about being wrong, but I'm also not worried about maybe I left behind something that I should have hung on to, because I'm not worried about that.
All right. Well, we've kept you a little bit longer than we had intended. Thank you for joining us. Do you have any final thoughts that you wanted to share to our audience?
It's the biggest thing you can always say: never be afraid to learn more things. Never be afraid to question, and never be afraid to say I don't know, because that's the only way you'll learn anything.
Thank you for joining us today.
David, it's been a pleasure having you again. I mean, we enjoyed the first time. It was just technical stuff with the darkness. But it's always a pleasure to have you, and we'd love to have you on again, maybe in a panel, to talk about some of these other issues. And I wish you well on, what you're going through with your family.
Thanks.
I have family members too that aren't very happy that I changed ministries and changed my view on things. So I can feel you, and all the way here from Arizona. But I wish you well, my friend.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
So, okay, icebreaker question. What's your favorite animal in the Bible, and why?
Oh man, the behemoth is just awesome. And the book of Job. Job is upset, and then his friends are kind of jerks, and then we go back to God talking to Job, and he's talking about the horses and the eagles and the unicorns and whatnot, and then we get to the behemoth, which is just this massive animal, and there's actually a bunch of euphemisms in the Hebrew about this animal, and so if I had to pick an animal that I like, it's going to be the behemoth.
Excellent.
Kristine, you're not going to get away with that question without you answering it too, because that's a good answer. Is behemoth? I think that might Ken Ham's favorite answer too, because he's sure that's a dinosaur, right?
Very possible.
Yeah.
Could be. Let's see. What's my favorite animal in the Bible? I think it's the bird, the little bird that God knows has lost a feather. That he cares enough about the birds to be aware of their situation. How much more does he care about us?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great answer for a show that emanates from the Sparrow's Call. So I'm not going to argue with you that. My daughter would kill me if I didn't say a unicorn, though. I mean, David mentioned that unicorn is a really bad translation of what they didn't know was the Hebrew word, so they threw in unicorn, I think. And I've just got to go with unicorn, because that's just, I like the backstory too. No, actually, I'm a Puddle Glum Narnian, so I would say Aslan is my favorite character in the Bible, Lion of Judah. But no, the unicorn is a strong second. So, all right, I think you've broken the ice.